They will give a brief opening statement about why they are running for governor. Then a moderator will ask them questions submitted from eminent members and the Center for Rural Policy and Development research staff. They will have roughly 8 minutes on stage. They will not be timed on each question. The number of questions answered will be determined by the length of each candidate's answers. A timekeeper over here, who is seated at this table, Mike Dalton, will let them know when their time is about to expire. Now I would like to introduce Marnie Werner, Interim Executive Director for the Center for Rural Policy and Development.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning. Thanks for coming today. Again, I'm Marnie Werner. I'm the interim executive director of the Center for Rural Policy and Development, and we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit policy research organization that's dedicated to providing research on rural issues. And we are really excited to be partnering with the Minnesota Newspaper Association and with our sponsor, Childcare Financial, to present this forum for candidates today where we can discuss rural issues, the issues that are really important to greater Minnesota. And now I'd like to introduce Stacy Martin. She's the Vice President of Corporate Engagement at Childcare Financial.
Thank you, Marnie. As Marnie said, Childcare Financial is a sponsor for this morning's forum, and we believe strongly in bridging that gap between the rural and metro areas, and also providing a platform for a good public policy discussion around those issues that are important to us as we provide financial services throughout the 3 states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, primarily focused on providing financial services to farmers and ranchers, and then also to others within rural communities and the agribusiness system. So rural issues are at the heart of what we do, and we're happy to be a sponsor today. Without further ado, we'll get things going here. I'd like to introduce, Mary's ready. She's back there. Okay, there she is. I wanted to make sure you were mic'd up and ready to go before I got you up here. Mariella Hammer. If any of you are political junkies in Minnesota like I am, she's basically a celebrity in my book when it comes to politics. So we have a celebrity in the house today, and she's going to be the one that's providing the mediation and running the governor's forum for us. But some background on Mary. She's been a host and political reporter for TPT, Twin Cities, PBS since 1998. She's won many regional Emmys, again, a celebrity in her own right, and numerous other awards in several states for her anchoring, reporting, producing, and photography. You may say Mary has been training for her job since birth. She learned the business under the wing of her father, Giuliani Hammer, an Associated Press Capitol reporter for more than 3 decades. So without further ado, please welcome Mary.
Okay. So we drew candidates' names from a hat. I witnessed it, so it's not fake news. It's real. Yep. The first one up, State Representative Erin Murphy. We will bring her on up. And as you've heard, the format are questions. A lot of the questions came from you. You were polled, members were polled. We really gleaned all these questions from the audience. We won't be taking audience questions, but we did cull them from all the feedback we got. Representative Erin Murphy, welcome.
Good morning, how are you? Good morning, how are you?
Good, and it's going to run about 8 minutes for each segment, and we do get to begin with an opening statement, maximum of a minute. You don't have to use it all, but just introduce yourself and maybe talk briefly to this audience from rural Minnesota.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you, everybody, for being here. It's really delightful to be before you today. My name is Erin Murphy. I'm a registered nurse and a teacher. I'm a mom of Anna and Bridget, twin girls. They are 26 years old now. And I'm a state legislator. I'm running for governor. I'm running for governor because I believe in a kind of politics that is about us, that is about improving people's lives, and when we use that together, we can build a really bright future for the people of Minnesota. I spent the last 11 years traveling and meeting with the people of Minnesota. They have been awesome teachers, and it is the preparation I believe needed to be able to be an effective governor for the state of Minnesota. I'm a registered nurse because I care a lot about people, and I'm in politics for the very same reason. And nursing has taught me something, and it's what makes me unique in this race. You are entrusted with the well-being and the health and the lives of people when you're taking care of them. And I feel that very same way as I run for governor for the state of Minnesota. People are looking for someone who's going to stick up for them, who's going to fight for them. And when I am given the opportunity to represent the interests of people, I do that very thing. I am really calm in a conflict. I am cool in a crisis, but I'm Irish, and I'm a fighter, and I'm going to fight for the people of Minnesota. And I'm happy to be with you this morning.
Thank you, Representative. Well, our first question, and this was the #1 issue that came through from all of you, is workforce availability. You know this issue in your communities. With a significantly older population, little immigration outside of some of those few economic centers, continued demand in the labor force, rural Minnesota can be seen as kind of a canary in the coal mine for the workforce shortages that we're having. So what kind of policy solutions specifically can you come up with in the next term, in the next decade, to alleviate some of those workforce concerns in rural Minnesota?
So we have workforce shortages across the state of Minnesota in many sectors, in manufacturing, in healthcare and education, among them. And I think we have a number of things that we need to do. Things that we've already been working on when I think about healthcare, making sure that people can work to the top of their license to make sure we have a workforce that can care for people across the state of Minnesota. Critically important, the partnerships between our state colleges and our two-year community colleges and manufacturers to make sure that we have the workforce skilled to do the work across the state of Minnesota. Putting the trades back in our high schools again is going to be really important because there are skilled jobs that are waiting for employees. Childcare, if we answer the childcare question, we release people who want to go back to work but can't because they're taking care of their kids, and there's an awesome effort in New York Mills right now to build a childcare co-op. They've been working for 2 years to build that co-op, but they know if they succeed that they're going to have people come to New York Mills to live and to work because there are good jobs there. And that's the way we do it. Minnesota is a mosaic. There's not one answer that's going to solve all these problems. And by knowing the different parts of Minnesota and understanding the needs, whether they're infrastructure, human capital investment, that is the way that we're going to build Minnesota's future.
I mentioned immigration in that initial question. Outside of those population centers where there is a lot of immigration, talk to me about an immigration policy that can help encourage people to settle and work and live in rural Minnesota.
So I had a really long conversation about driver's licenses for people who are not documented when we did a house party in Wilmer. And there was a young man who worked at the poultry processing plant there. And there was an older retired nurse who didn't like my answer about driver's licenses. And we had quite a long conversation in that home. And the young man who was with me talked about why it was important that people had access to a driver's license so they could safely get to work, get their kids to school without fear of deportation.
What your policy is and what that retired nurse did not like about you.
She didn't like the idea, my idea.
Okay, oh, was it you?
She liked me just fine.
Okay.
I support the idea that people who are in Minnesota, Minnesotans working but not documented, should have access to a driver's license. It's a public safety issue, but it is also a critical identification piece so people can get to work safely. And without it, it is hard for people to get to work and stay in work. So that is a policy that I believe across the state of Minnesota would help employers and employees get to work in a reliable way. And when you listen to employers, reliability is an issue. And then underneath that issue, Mariella Hammer, this is the important part, underneath that issue was the issue of race and immigration and what's right and what's wrong. And that's the conversation we need to continue to have. And at the end of that 20-minute conversation with that group of people in Wilmer, the woman who wasn't so sure that she liked my position on that question moved. Because we spent some time talking about it. And when I think about race and equity across the state of Minnesota, there are people of color coming from different parts of the world working all over the state of Minnesota. And we need to embrace the good of that diversity because it is critical to the infrastructure of our workplaces going forward in the state of Minnesota.
Okay, next closely related subject, workforce housing. There is a serious shortage of housing, especially for middle-income folks in greater Minnesota. What do you think is the root of this problem, and what can you do about it?
Well, there is a housing shortage all over the state of Minnesota. And I like to think about the whole of the state. And I know we're here today talking about rural Minnesota, and certainly in the northeastern part of the state, up the North Shore, and the northwestern part of the state. And where we have workforce shortages, they are complicated by housing shortages. And that has been a problem for a number of years, and we continue to do work both in the private sector and with public funding to invest in both workforce housing and affordable housing for people.
What can a governor do specifically on this?
I think a governor can absolutely continue to propose funding in my budget so that we continue to do that work, and we target the funding to the places where they're having shortages.
And how about incentives for people if we do get the housing in Greater Minnesota? What about incentives to encourage people to move to Greater Minnesota and then stay?
I practiced nursing first in Marshfield, Wisconsin. Marshfield, town of 18,000 people in the middle of Wisconsin. Great big hospital, very small community. Manufactured housing, farm economy, and healthcare were the three driving economic factors there. It was hard to recruit people to come to Marshfield. And a lot of people came there, practiced for a while, and left. I think we have to think about place. And we have to recognize the placemaking ability of communities and to support that.
What does that mean, and how do you support that?
When you think about the communities across the state that have some giddy up, right? There are places that are working together to solve problems, and I see this all over. When I was in New York Mills, that group of people, city councilors, the mayor, county commissioner, people that from economic development, the employers from that community, people from Head Start coming together to solve that problem. Okay. They are building a sense of place. New London, a sense of place. Fergus Falls, a sense of place. When a community has got that figured out, it is what draws people to a community. A good school, affordable health care, transportation, broadband, those critical factors need to be there. But so is that sense of place, and there is a group of people that have been working on art and placemaking across this country, focusing particularly on rural communities. Kelly Ash, who's here, who works for this organization, was my good teacher on this issue. And when we think we want people to move to small communities, you got to make sure that there's a reason, the building blocks, but also
we are running out of time. We want to make sure, and you did touch on some of the other issues, healthcare, education. We want to drill down with you and other candidates on that, but we want to end with each candidate with a specific question written just for you.
All right.
And this one you vaguely touched on, but we want to make sure you hit this before we let you go. There's a nursing shortage in Minnesota. It's particularly harmful in rural areas, and what are you going to do to specifically address that nursing shortage and convince them to move?
So there are nurses practicing all over the state of Minnesota. And we have done a lot of work already to make sure that the nurses that are practicing can work to the top of their license, especially advanced practice nurses who are going to solve our primary care conundrum. And when I think about the work we've done with community health workers, public health nurses, parish nurses, we have a stock of nurses, many who are not practicing right now. We want to make sure that the work that they're doing is something that they love to do, so they come back. But we're training enough. We want to make sure that they're practicing at the top of their license so they can meet the aging population of Minnesota.
Does that incent them to move and stay?
Placemaking incents them to move and stay.
Okay, thank you. Democratic Representative Erin Murphy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. All right. In the bullpen warming up and batter up, State Representative Paul Thissen, another Democrat. He's from Minneapolis. Come on up.
How are you?
Good. We should make sure you're really ready to come out from the pitcher's mound here, right? So next one up after you is Jeff Johnson. All right, we're going to start with that same question at the top. Workforce. You heard the questions. Older population, not much immigration outside of those population centers. How are you going to fill all those jobs that are there in rural Minnesota?
Yeah, well, I think that, well, first of all, thank you for having me today, and I really do want to thank the Center for Rural Policy and Development. They do, you all do amazing work across the state and really inform a lot of the great public policy discussions we have. So thank you for doing that work for so long. It's something I've really been a real supporter of and champion at the legislature because they really do amazing things.
Great,
So,
and how about the question?
right, well, you didn't give me an introduction, so I'm
that's right, you do get an
okay.
introduction.
I don't care.
Do you want a further introduction?
No, that's fine.
Okay. I think it's more fun to dive in.
That's all I wanted to say.
I appreciate
All
that.
right. So in terms of the workforce development, I do think that there is a lot that we can do as a state government. And, some of the things that were identified, that Erin identified, I think are at the heart of it. As I go around the state, there's really two things we can do, right, to fill our workforce needs. One is to look in our own refrigerator and make sure that we're using the resources that are there, and one is going to the grocery store and bringing new people in. And I think we need to pursue both of those areas. In terms of using the folks that are already living in communities. The things we need to think about, first of all, we need to make this a state where you can choose to live where you want to and make sure that quality of life is there and those institutional supports are there to allow that to happen. So one of the roles of state government and the next governor is going to be making sure that we actually have those institutions that are supported. You see, for instance, in Albert Lea right now, you see a decision being made by the Mayo system to close down part of that hospital. And when that starts to happen, you start to undermine the fabric of those communities. Sometimes it costs more to support institutions in less dense places, and we need to be willing to step up as a state and make sure that we're making those additional investments, because in the short term it may cost a little bit more, but in the long term it's going to pay off. Childcare is the two things I hear about more than anything as I go around the state. Childcare and affordable housing, the two things that you hit on. When I was up in Wadena recently, we talked to the small business, and this is not the parents talking about, this is the business community talking about it. And they said the biggest challenge we face, we did a study, we have 500 slots of unfilled childcare slots in our region. Austin, Minnesota, 800 slots.
So what can a governor do for creating more childcare?
Well, there's three things that we can do. We can put more money into the system, into the subsidy system, which would help the providers, which would help the parents, and most importantly, which would help the workers who are among the most underpaid folks doing some of the most important work we have in this state. When I came into the legislature in 2002, 2003, we faced a big budget deficit. How did we balance that? We cut LGA and we cut childcare subsidies, and we have never recovered on either of those to the levels that we were even at 15 years ago. So we need to move that money, move that investment up, and there's been a lot of legislative reports that tells us that we need to change the regulatory environment so that people can actually run those businesses in a more effective way, and we probably overregulate the childcare industry, and we need to look at that. And then we need to provide grants and support. Erin talked about one example. There's another example down in Spring Grove where the community has come together and they created, with some city and county investment, a child care center for the folks living in that community. So I think all three of those things are places that we can go to make sure that those jobs are freed up, that parents can have a safe place for their kids to go. And with that, I think we can make big progress.
And let's talk numbers and population. We know statistically folks aren't generally moving from the metro to rural Minnesota, and that immigration can be a potential pool of workers. How do you encourage that and enable that?
Well, I think we need to have, have the discussions. One of the things I've talked about a lot in this race, and that we need to do a much better job of, generally speaking, is making sure that we move from what is now considered to be the second most unequal state in the country in terms of racial issues to the most equal state. And we need to adopt policies that are going to move us in that direction. I think that solves part of this issue.
And what kind of policies?
One of the things that I proposed to move in that direction is actually to create new American centers all around the state of Minnesota that would allow people to navigate the system more effectively, that would allow the interchange between different members of the community to talk and work things out, that would allow for cultural exchange, which I think can grow those ties together that make a difference. But at the end of the day, the way you do it is you also have to start paying decent wages to people. And if there's one thing that we could do to solve the workforce shortage, it would be to raise the wages that people are being paid, because that's what draws people to your community.
What about the housing component? You touched on that, but can you drill down more on how the state can create more affordable housing? Yeah,
in greater Minnesota, as I've traveled around the state, the biggest issue that you see is there is a gap in financing. So in the metro area, the banks can come in and say, well, we can look at, in some parts of greater Minnesota, we can look at the rents and we're going to loan you the money because we can see what the rent levels are going to actually be able to cover the cost of what it takes to build a building. That's not always the case in greater Minnesota. So when a bank comes in the private sector, they're going to look at what the average rents are in the community, the average wages, and they're going to see what the cost of building the building is, and the two don't align. So the biggest thing that the state can do is actually provide that gap financing to make sure that those buildings get built. And we know that that's the case. It just is a matter of political will to get it done.
We'll talk about healthcare a little bit later, but I want to jump ahead to education. And earlier, the issue of trades came up, and that's another, when we talk workforce shortage, there's a great shortage of trades and trades workers in greater Minnesota. And take that to the education question. Should everybody be getting a 4-year MINSCU degree in greater Minnesota, or do we need to incent more 2-year skilled workers?
Well, I don't think this is a question of greater Minnesota or the metro area. I think across the state, we need more people getting those kind of jobs and getting that kind of training.
And how do we do that? Have we created the society where people only want to go get 4-year degrees?
We're starting to. And so part of it is educating parents and students about the really great wages that you can get in jobs that don't require 4-year degrees. And that's the case. There's a perfect example of this, I think, in Faribault, Minnesota, where the school district, the high school, and even the junior high, has partnered with a lot of the great manufacturers in that community to have kids just come and visit and see what's going on in the manufacturing going on there. Because there is this myth out there that we have in our heads that, this kind of work is dirty and it's hard and it's dangerous. And, in some cases that's the case. But a lot of manufacturing today is actually, very high tech. And so even that simple exposure makes a big difference. And then in Faribault, the high school and the community college are linking together to provide that kind of technical training as kids come up. So we just need kids to work with their hands more and be exposed to it and get the parents exposed. And I think in that way, we're actually going to start to break through that.
We're already at your last question. And again, this is one specific to you, but as I kind of hinted, it's healthcare related. So you spent much of your career in the legislature working on healthcare, and with the passage of MNsure, Minnesotans in rural communities are left with often only one option for health insurance and have to travel long distances to get to a care provider. What would you do as governor to help that issue?
Well, I think there's two things. The first is I do think that the idea of allowing people to buy into Minnesota Care on the insurance side is an obvious first step, and I think strongly supported as I've gone around the state, having that public option available to get affordable coverage. We're going to need to raise the reimbursement rates to providers if we do that, because the cross subsidies will be different, but that's a clear thing. The other thing we need to do is we need to invest in rural hospitals and make sure that there's strong rural hospitals within 30 miles of everybody, because the rural hospital is the center of the healthcare ecosystem. When you have a strong rural hospital, you're going to have stronger clinics, you're going to have stronger mental health workforce, you're going to draw on the folks that can provide the healthcare for folks. So having that core piece, I think, is really critical.
All right, thank you. Representative Paul Thissen, Democrat.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. All right, next up. How are we doing? Are they answering questions sufficiently? Yeah? Okay. Just yell if they're not, right? Give me feedback. Come on. Jeff Johnson, our first Republican to hit the stage. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hennepin County Commissioner, former state representative, and the beneficiary of an endorsement yesterday.
Yes, that was nice.
With Representative Matthew getting out of the race. Do you want to do a quick opening statement? Tell people who you are? Yeah.
All right. Background on me, I'm Jeff Johnson. I was born and raised in Detroit Lakes. My wife is from Crookston. We went to college in Moorhead. So we're actually children of northern, northwestern Minnesota. We have been in Plymouth for 20 or so years. I have 2 teenage boys. Thor's in college. Rolf is in high school. I've actually spent most of my adult life in the private sector, the past 16 years being self-employed, and then also during that time I served 6 years in the House, and now I'm in my 3rd and final term as the lone conservative on the Hennepin County Board in Minneapolis. And I got in the race 9 months ago, 10 months ago, for a really simple, straightforward reason: to give people more control over their own money, over their own businesses, over their own property and farms, over their own health care. I think we have seen an arrogance in state government, especially state agencies, the past decade or so, that really needs to change, and that's what I will wake up every morning as your governor with a goal to do.
And I'll just editorialize. Perhaps you're Norwegian with children named Thor and Rolf.
Perhaps.
Perhaps, okay. Workforce availability, as you heard, the major issue here. So with this older population, not a lot of new folks coming in, what can you do to incent folks to move and fill the jobs that are there and the needs that are there?
Yeah, I think there's actually 2 pieces to this. So the first piece is, I think part of it is just a training deficit. We have to make sure, and government can help do that, make sure that our schools, whether they are high schools or tech schools or colleges, are teaching our kids the skills that the business community believes they'll need in 5 or 10 years. We could do a much better job of that. The other piece is, I think, just a bigger picture cultural issue, which you touched on. There is this belief in our society, and it's all over the state, that if a kid doesn't go get a 4-year degree, they're somehow not all that successful. And I feel it right now. We have a junior in high school. We live in Plymouth, in the suburbs, and he's trying to decide what he wants to do next. I know full well, if he decides that he wants to go learn a trade, there are going to be some people in the community, some of his friends' parents, who are going to feel a little bit sorry for us. That, well, he didn't go to, St. Olaf or out east to a 4-year degree. We have to change that culture and that attitude. A governor can do that just by using the bully pulpit and constantly talking about how proud we should be of these kids that make that choice. The choice that is best for them and actually fills a need that we have in society, rather than feeling sorry for them or thinking that they're not successful. I think that will help a lot.
What about the folks who are moving to rural Minnesota? And if we talk about those population centers, those are immigrants. Those are the people who are willing and able to do those jobs. Do you want to incent that? And if so, how?
Incent?
Immigration to rural Minnesota.
Well, I don't know that I would incent immigration to any particular place, and I think we always have to make this distinction between legal immigration and illegal immigration. I often hear the argument made that it's one and the same, and it's not, and I believe we should actually do something about illegal immigration. But when you talk about immigrants, absolutely, we've always been a very welcoming state, and we should continue to be so. But when I look at how we are, when I look at our business climate in this state, we are not encouraging the creation of jobs to actually allow some of these immigrants to work. A lot of the immigrants that come into this state are very entrepreneurial. I hear this from many of them. They want to start a little business, sometimes a very small one-person business. We make it very difficult in Minnesota, whether it's occupational licensing that keeps people out, whether it's some of the regulations, certainly whether it's the taxes that we have in this state that do not compete with the states that surround us. We can say we want to be welcoming all we want, but then when we make it really hard for them to actually create jobs or work in a job, it doesn't work very well.
How about the housing component now? We talk about there are these jobs there. We want folks to move to rural Minnesota, but we need to provide housing. And it's just not there right now.
Right, it is, particularly in pockets of greater Minnesota. And you will never hear me be an advocate for government creating or owning housing. I do not think that's the answer, and I don't think that's the right role for government. But government certainly can create incentives for the private sector in certain parts of the state, as I think we do right now.
What kind of incentives? Tax
incentives, essentially, for the private sector to say, if you are going to invest or build in certain areas of the state, I think that there is room for that, and I think that's the best path forward. I will add that part of the problem with affordable housing all over the state has been government created. I saw a study, it was a few months ago, that showed that on average our housing was much higher than the national average, partly because of all the mandates that we put on builders. That's part of the problem.
How about healthcare? We started with a nurse, so we've been touching on that with each person. And the lack of providers, the distance folks have to drive. What can we do to help rural healthcare? We obviously, the legislature weighed in and helped farmers out a little bit. What about small businesses and helping really bridge that divide?
Competition. It comes down to competition, and the path that we've taken as government is to eliminate competition or try to eliminate competition rather than encourage more competition. Because the more competition there is, the more choices you have. And when I look, the issue of MNsure comes up a lot, and sometimes the answer is we just got to eliminate MNsure. And I can't disagree with that, but that doesn't solve the problem. The problem is not about a computer system. It's about this philosophy we have that government should tell people exactly what their health insurance should look like. And so my belief is, number one, you start pulling back mandates, which is really easy to say, but very difficult to do politically because it doesn't sound nice. But I happen to believe that if someone thinks that the best thing for them or for their family is a catastrophic policy with a high deductible because they're very healthy, who am I as governor or government to say that's not right for you and we're not going to let you do that?
Okay, since you're the first Republican up here, you get a Trump question.
Oh, nice.
But there's a policy layer to it.
Okay.
In relation to international trade, we know commodity prices are low and yields have been up, so a lot of people are storing right now, waiting to see what happens with international trade. The president has been a little bit of a wild card on what he's going to do with international trade. What would you like to see from the Trump administration in terms of international trade and specifically how it affects rural Minnesota?
You know, he and I probably disagree on this issue. I generally support his policies. I think here is an area where you're going to see some difference on a policy standpoint. I tend to believe that the freer the trade, the better, as long as it's fair. We can't let people take advantage of us. I think the more that we can encourage actual exports, the better. And if we are slapping tariffs on things, we go in the other direction.
Okay, and your last specific to you question. You said you intend to conduct an all-encompassing audit of state government. What programs or funding would you eliminate?
Well, that's the whole point of the audit, Mary, is to figure that out. Rather than go in and say, I know what works and what doesn't, what I would like to, and by the way, this is going to take years. This is not something that you go in and do in a few months, and I want an outside organization to do it and start the process.
But you work in county government and you've worked in state government. What's your sense after, especially being a state lawmaker, what areas you would start with?
Human services it's the second largest portion of the government. It's fast growing as pretty much any area of the government. And that is the area where we have some programs that are doing wonderful things to help people become self-sufficient or help the most vulnerable live. And I think that's the appropriate role of government. We also have a lot of programs, I can say this from firsthand experience, that we fund because it makes politicians feel good. And I'm tired of the era of doing things just because it makes us feel good.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you,
Great.
Republican Jeff Johnson. Appreciate it. Thank you. All right. Keith Downey, come on up. With great haste. Welcome. Former state representative, party chair, Keith Downey. Yeah, welcome. Have a seat. You can tell the folks a little bit more about yourself quickly.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Keith Downey, and I'm, I think, a bit different from any other candidate in the race in that my primary background is in business. I was 23 years with a few technology firms and then a management consultancy where I did a lot of work in state and local government. After that, I spent 4 years in the legislature trying to bring a lot of those business perspectives to the table at a time when we had $6 and $4 billion deficits not too long ago, 2009 and the like. And then I spent the last 4 years as the state party chair at the Republican Party of Minnesota. You may remember we were in deep trouble back in 2012 after a horrible election. We were able to reduce our spending by 50%, our debt by over 60%, and we started winning some elections again. So I decided to throw my hat in the ring for governor and bring some of those same things to the race.
Okay, let's start with that first question. Everybody has fielded workforce availability and the demographic problem that's going on in rural Minnesota. We're aging, not a lot of folks are moving in. What can you do to help that?
Well, it's actually, I think we're talking about a symptom here. And a big piece of why I'm running and the theme of my campaign is to make Minnesota work for everyone. And you travel the state and you hear stories like you're describing and you realize that it's not. And most of it stems from the fact that the fundamentals in Minnesota are not trending in the right direction. And I'm not a negative person. I grew up in Minnesota. This is a fantastic state. We have so many native strengths. But right now we have the public sector crowding out the private sector. We have regulatory regimes that are distorting all kinds of things to the point that Minnesota, 14 out of the last 15 years, we have been a net out-migration state for people. We're a net out-migration state for business, for capital, for personal wealth. And you realize that we have distorted things and gotten to the point economically that we're pushing all of our native strengths out of our state. And so we have to address that fundamental issue, and then we can get at the issues like workforce. You can't expect to have a healthy workforce if more people are moving out of your state to other states than are moving from other states to your state. And so the fundamentals are what we have to get at, and I'm glad to talk about them more, but to think that you can add more training or do something when the absolutely fundamental demographic and other trends in the state are upside down. Our next governor has to address those things and make Minnesota competitive to build a state where we are growing, where we're creating opportunity and growth for everybody. We do that, and a lot of these issues, I think, go away.
You mentioned demographics. How about the demographic that is increasing in rural Minnesota, and those are immigrants, especially in those population centers? What do you want to continue to incent that? Do you want to slow immigration? What's your approach here in the state?
So again, this is a bit of an imbalance that's been created by the fact that we are not retaining native-born people. And I ask people 3 questions when I start some speeches. Are you concerned that your kids are going to stay in Minnesota? Are you concerned your parents might not stay in Minnesota? Are you concerned whether you might not stay in Minnesota? And you see the light bulbs turn on. And so we have this imbalance, and so we can talk about immigration and refugee resettlement, and I think we need way more balance in it. And
That was the question,
communities-
yes.
Local
What about-
communities need to have a say in that, but again, that is a symptom of a broader problem that Minnesota just isn't competitive. Our state GDP this year is going to be about half the national
What about the
average.
immigrants, though? What do you want, more or less coming in?
I want a
Realistic.
healthy balance of everybody coming and going to the state, but we're attracting people from international areas because we are losing people here natively. And so this problem that's exacerbated where companies don't see that they have a workforce, and so we have immigration and illegal immigration in numbers that cause disruption for local communities. If we don't get at the fundamentals of it, none of this is going to be fixed. And so we can put Band-Aids on everything, and governors can give speeches and talk about policies on immigration and workforce programs. It's the fundamentals, people. We have got to make Minnesota competitive again.
What about this very closely related issue of housing in rural Minnesota? Is there a state role in that?
A minimal one, frankly.
Okay.
I mean, we probably should back the state off. Right now, you talk to the builders, and I don't know what the number is, $18,000, $25,000 added to the construction of every house based on state regulatory regimes, to the point where you can't build low-cost housing profitably in Minnesota anymore. And so what are they building? They're building medium and high-priced housing, right? So we have all of these distortions that an overly intrusive government has created. And so, you know, it begs an obvious question. So if people are there working and have a job and have money, why is there nobody there available to build a house for them if they want one? There are distortions that have been imposed through regulatory regimes, and we have to just get government out of that business.
Let's talk healthcare, and let's talk healthcare infrastructure, lack of providers, but then also the state. You've been very critical of the state role in MNsure and how we are helping or not helping the healthcare situation in rural Minnesota. What do you want to do?
Well, so right now we're at a point where the problems in the insurance market are about to have a significant impact on the healthcare delivery system. To date in Minnesota, the problems with insurance have not adversely impacted what's actually going on in care delivery. But you're seeing local hospitals being shut down. You're starting to see some of the disruptions and distortions hurt people, and so we need to back off. We need to back off on MNsure and Obamacare, undo the penalties and the mandates and the goofy actuarial rules that they're required to underwrite their insurance on. And I have a plan called Healthy Minnesota that actually will convert people to income-adjusted vouchers so that they can go out and get the insurance that they want, that's priced for them, that has the benefits that they want. And guess what? Again, all of the distortions in the healthcare marketplace that are right now forcing providers to make decisions based on what the bureaucrats decide in St. Paul and Washington, D.C., those things go away. When people can buy the insurance they want, go get the care they want from the provider they want, things normalize and settle back in. Folks need to realize all of these things are symptoms of what we're doing.
Let's stay federal, and let's make that Trump transition now, and specifically to international trade and how it's affecting farmers and the rural economy. Where do you stand with the president on this?
So you said he was a bit of a wild card, but I don't think he's been a wild card. I think he's actually a fairly savvy negotiator. And so we're going to see, I think, over the next few years, a restructuring of some of those trade agreements. And I think those will be positive developments from what I can tell. I have always been a free trade advocate. But I think what we forgot about on the business side is the dislocation that comes from free trade. And so we have not been, I don't think, attentive enough to the retraining and the reskilling of the workforce. So I think a rethinking of our overall trade relationships nationally and what we're doing here in Minnesota it'll benefit us.
Final question, written specifically for you. You represented Edina while you were in the House. Your background is very metro-focused. How are you going to relate to and understand the concerns of rural Minnesota?
Yeah, actually I had the benefit for the last 4 years of traveling the state as state party chair, and I think I have a pretty good sense of what's going on. And I'll be really honest, In 2012, when the Democrats won complete control of the legislature and the governorship, they really took it to Greater Minnesota. And Republicans in 2014
Okay, how
and
about you?
2016.
How about you?
Well,
You,
hold on.
okay,
Let me
you're
finish.
almost out of time.
I understand. And so Republicans regained majorities, and you know how they did it? By educating Greater Minnesota on what had just happened. And so here we sit, in some ways a polarized, divided state. Our next governor has got to stand for this whole state. We need to make this state work for everyone. And I'm telling you, if we fix the fundamentals, there will be growth and opportunity throughout this state, and we won't have people pitting themselves, one person against each other. In a time of scarcity, people get pitted against each other. In a time of growth and opportunity, everyone benefits and everyone grows across this entire state. So that's what I will do to bring Minnesota back together.
Okay, thank you. Out of time. Republican, keep down. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Now we have Woodbury Mayor, Mary. We could have two Marys on stage. Giuliani Stephens, come on up. I won't ask her again if she's going to run as Mayor Giuliani. There might be a little name ID in that, right?
That is my name, though, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Welcome. Do you want to just briefly tell the folks who you are?
I will, thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for having me here and congratulations to Brad Finstad. I understand that President Trump appointed him to a position in the USDA. And then, of course, good luck finding the replacement. That's always a challenge. I think for purposes of you have my bio. What I'd like to share is I'm currently the mayor of Woodbury, Minnesota, the 9th largest city. And when I ran for mayor 7 years ago, I had 3 priorities that I felt were critical for our city's success, for any city's success: job creation, economic development, and making government efficient and effective. And 7 years later, as I sit here, I'm pretty proud of what we've accomplished. Jobs are up over 17%. 2,800 more than that homes have been built. And just in the last 4 years, we've had over 270 new businesses join the community. Woodbury has been recognized not only in Minnesota, but in the United States as one of the best places to live. In fact, Money Magazine came out last week and said Woodbury was the best place to live in Minnesota. And I bring an understanding of what communities need to thrive. So access, good preschool and school choices, infrastructure, basic infrastructure, roads, water, sewer, all to support that diversity of housing stock and a good business economy. So I really think what Minnesota needs is a chief executive who's going to have a creative, can-do, and common sense approach to government.
Okay, let's start with workforce availability in rural Minnesota. And you've heard the questions: aging demographic, folks not moving in. What do you do to turn that tide around?
Yeah, and yours was specific. I want to start with Greater Minnesota has different regions. So there's actually workers in some regions with no jobs. You're talking about jobs there with no workers to fill. And I think that is consistent in a lot of the regions. If you talk to Senator Carrie Ruud, she'll tell you in the Brainerd Lakes area, they've got manufacturing jobs that can't be filled. I was just in Rochester, which is a large area, visiting with a high school friend who's got a family plumbing business, and he said it's getting harder and harder to get skilled workers there. But I think we're making progress, and we need to continue to do the things that are working. So it's the partnerships. If you look at Detroit Lakes, and that's not unique, but you look at the businesses that are getting together with the high schools, that are getting together with our tech schools and our two-year colleges to look at programs that can be put in place to get our young children on a pathway to success. So a lot of those classes were taken out in the recession, and of course, not only do we need to add those, but we need to add the new training for jobs of the future. And so we're going to continue to have that connection to make sure that our kids thrive. And I tell my kids how success is defined by when you align your passions with your skills. So let's work with parents and teachers to help our children find their career paths, whether it's vocational training, whether it's four-year college, whatever it is, so that they can find their success.
What about shortages in healthcare in particular? There's many communities across rural Minnesota where they're down to one doctor who's about to retire, or a dentist or nursing. What about that specific area?
So I do think one of the things in an overriding healthcare redesign, and since you're talking access, we'll go specifically to that, is really to support innovation in that area. And when I think of access in the smaller areas, so my father was a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic. I think of the technology advances in that area and how healthcare is delivered. And I think of the ability to access remotely your nurse, your physician's assistant, your doctor, and I equate it to the old days when we used to have house calls. And that technology now allows people to have access via that technology and continuum of care. Also, there's technology with devices where you're actually, I have a friend who's actually having her heart monitored and all the tests done on her cell phone, and then she will send that in. So I believe there are models where people can access that, particularly for preventive care, that will decrease their requirement to go to hospitals. I also think there's an opportunity for the clinics and the healthcare providers to get with private sector ride shares on the event you need your healthcare visit, that you can get people there. So I think there's all kinds of creativity and innovations that are out there that can make access available in a new and different way that we just haven't seen, and innovation is going to provide that.
How about, again, looking at the demographics of who is moving to these regional centers and immigration? What do you want to do to slow or speed or recognize the jobs that immigrants are filling in rural Minnesota?
Well, I think there's jobs for immigrants. I mean, my grandfather came over from Italy in 1914 through Ellis Island. He was an immigrant, and he started out in the coal mines in Pennsylvania, and then he became an entrepreneur. Somebody mentioned entrepreneurs. He opened his own grocery store and raised and educated 6 children. So I think there are jobs there, and I think they can fill them, and we want all people to fill positions that work for them. So.
Okay. How about housing? Let's move to that then. Housing for these folks who need to be moving to rural Minnesota.
Housing.
Yeah, workforce housing.
Complicated
problems.
issue.
Yep.
You've heard financing, land prices. Certainly, I speak with builders, I speak with developers, I speak with building organizations, and those in the workforce housing area. And there are challenges there. And some of the challenges are the regulatory environment at a city level and a state level. And the regulations that not individually might seem burdensome, but when you add them up and cumulatively add the cost, it just is cost prohibitive to build.
Okay.
I think we need to look at our housing policy and make sure that the housing finance policy is fair across the state. And then I really like the Habitat for Humanity model for housing. Woodbury has the most Habitat homes outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I think it's a model that's effective and works.
How about an international issue now and trade and the major impact it has on the farming community and the rural economy? What do you think about President Trump's stance looking at renegotiating some of the trade deals?
Well, I think he's got a great stance. I think that we want our trade negotiations to be fair. Having said that, as governor, you represent Minnesota. I think at the most current count, there's 81,000 farms. So you want to stand up for farmers where that international market is important for them. To get into that market and be successful there. So with respect to that policy, when we're renegotiating those trade agreements, they have to be fair and give Minnesota farmers access to the international market. That's how we're going to thrive as a community and as a state. And so as President Trump is renegotiating those, if it's not favorable to Minnesota, I'll pick up the phone and give him a call and tell him that. And we'll have a conversation.
Okay, your final question, custom made just for you,
All right.
is you tout your experience, especially executive experience, and you mentioned you are a metro mayor. How did that prepare you to understand the concerns of greater Minnesota?
I might take a little issue with the metro mayor piece. So
you are a metro mayor, though.
I'm a metro mayor in definition, but in terms of focus, we have issues that are a little different from maybe some of the larger cities in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I think what I bring with respect to greater Minnesota is, as governor, one of the things I would say is I will not do a one-size-fits-all to greater Minnesota. I recognize the needs are different. We are one state and one family, but even in my family, my children are different, so recognizing that.
Okay.
I also think I bring, you want me to end?
You are out of time
I'm
technically.
sorry, I want to keep going.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor.
Because I don't
Mary.
feel I finished that question, but
Giuliani
thank you very
Stephens.
much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. We have another mayor next up. I have Mayor Chris Coleman. Are you ready? I know you've got long legs. You can stride up here very quickly. It's mayor time up here. We have Democrat Chris Coleman, Mayor of St. Paul, former mayor officially now,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah,
That's right.
It's over.
I got kicked out. They took away my health insurance, my paycheck, so I'm unemployed.
So you need a new job. Tell
need a new
us
job.
why you want to be governor.
Well, I want to be governor because I believe Minnesota needs a governor who's a champion for families across the state of Minnesota, who's going to advocate for the financial and economic security that our families need to be successful. And that has to be regardless of where you live, whatever part of the state, whatever your family background is, you need a champion. And I've been that for 12 years as mayor of St. Paul, and I can take that across the state of Minnesota.
Okay. You know the first question, workforce availability. We've been talking about older
I knew that was
population.
coming.
Yes, you knew it was coming, so I barely have to ask you. What can you as governor, what can the state do on this issue?
Well, first of all, every CEO and every person that I've talked to across the state, it doesn't matter whether you're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company in the Twin Cities or you're a pork producer in greater Minnesota, this is an issue for you. And we have to start off with not leaving any child behind. We need to make sure that the kids are graduating from high school right now in the state of Minnesota are prepared to take their place in the 21st century workforce. We need to create vibrant communities, places that will attract folks.
And how do you do that as
Well, I
governor?
think the interesting thing, and if you looked at the criteria that Amazon used for their new headquarters, a lot of it was about that kind of vibrancy that will attract people who have options of going anywhere in the world. And so in St. Paul, people, might see this, while you're the big city, but we had the same challenges that many of our rural communities are facing. How do we get people to move back into St. Paul when all of those jobs were moving over to the North Loop, when they were moving into downtown Minneapolis? So we really focused on a vibrancy strategy. How do we activate our arts community? How do we activate our main streets? How do we attract bars and restaurants? How do we,
how do you do that?
So you do that by first of all focusing on what you're best at. Think about what Don Ness did up in Duluth. He rebranded Duluth to be a place where if you're an outdoors person, you want to come there, you want to be a part of it. Quite frankly, I think craft beers have an extremely odd place in all of this economic development. Look at what Ben Shire is doing in Fergus Falls. He and his family opened up a pizza joint in a brewery on Main Street in Fergus Falls because he's just creating a place where people want to live. When you think about Otter Tail County, they have 1,000 lakes in Otter Tail County. It's an incredible place to be outdoors, but you also have to have a place where you can get a job. You have to have broadband internet access. This is a huge part of the future of all of our communities across the state of Minnesota. How are you going to attract a family to a community where you have to get your kids in a car and drive around so you have enough signal that they can do their homework? We have to have broadband internet, and we need to move that quicker. And we need to invest in some of those amenities that make our communities great places to live.
How about housing, that aspect of it?
Yeah, it's huge. I was up in Polaris in Roseville last February, and they said that one of the reasons they didn't expand in Roseville was because there wasn't workforce housing. And the cost of building a house in Roseville is not dramatically cheaper than it is to build in the Twin Cities, but what you can get for that house is dramatically different. And so we have to provide incentives, we have to provide tax breaks, we have to provide the tools and the resources that are necessary to be able to subsidize some of that workforce housing. Otherwise, we're going to lose those opportunities to expand at places like War Road and Polaris and Digi-Key and Marvin, whatever it might be.
And how about healthcare access? That's another major issue here.
Well, the problem is these decisions about healthcare are being made in corporate boardrooms that have no connection to the communities that they're supposed to serve. If you look at the decision to remove the ICU and the birth unit at the hospital in Albert Lea, that has a dramatic impact. And talk about trying to attract families. If you're a family, or you want to start a family, and you don't even have a birth center in your community, this is a huge thing. So we have to have policies that better reflect the needs of the community.
How can a governor get in the boardroom and really affect those decisions?
Well, first of all, don't incentivize. I love Mayo. Mayo is an incredible asset to the state of Minnesota, and I don't want to disparage them at all. But the fact of the matter is the state of Minnesota gave Mayo a lot of money for their expansion in Rochester, And there weren't very many strings attached to that. But I think that one of the things that we should have demanded is that they were going to provide consistent service in their service area and not just consolidate everything over to Austin or up to Mankato and take those rural those hospitals out of smaller communities. And there are opportunities, by the way. The rural physician apprenticeship program through the University of Minnesota is a great way to get doctors that are in their third year of medical school at the university to go out and work in rural communities. There's a lot of things that we can do to help assure that there is good medical care, but that's, you can't wonder why people aren't moving into greater Minnesota when they don't have access to those basic amenities that we take for granted if you're in St. Paul or Minneapolis.
You mentioned apprenticeship. It's a good transition to the educational aspect of this. And the question that's been coming up over and over too, if we need to change this model. Yes, 4-year degrees are great. NSCU does a great job of that in greater Minnesota. Do we need to get into the middle schools and the high schools and really start working on vocational education to help those shortages?
Yeah, 100%. I look at some of the trades programs and the apprenticeship programs that they have. Earn while you learn. Their kids aren't coming out hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, which unfortunately my kids are coming out of college heavily indebted. But they come out, they've earned while they learn. And they're getting jobs, not paying minimum wages, but $25-30 an hour plus benefits, health care, and pensions and all those things. So we need to expose kids to those. We took those programs out of the high school. They don't have that kind of reference point, and I think that we should expand those programs. And then show the pathway to our technical colleges. You go up to St. Cloud Technical College, they have these incredible programs. They're half empty, and we need to make sure that we're getting kids into those programs.
Very good. You're going fast enough that you get an issue that hasn't come up yet.
Oh, damn.
Wow. Water. The use of chemicals and pesticides in agricultural production and disease prevention is a growing topic at the Capitol, and we're not just talking buffers. I was told the audience is buffered out, so that's not exactly what we're talking about. But what would you do with Governor Dayton's positions on these issues?
Well, look, clean water is just a right. I mean, this is like, if there were 4 freedoms for Minnesota, clean water would be one of them. And I think that we have to make sure that we know what's in our drinking wells. And this is not a rural versus urban issue. Look at the issues that we're facing in Cottage Grove and in the East Metro area. Mayor Stevenson, Giuliani Stephens, I know that this is an issue for her community. So we need to know what's in our drinking water. We need to have a program to help if you have a well or you have a municipal system. We need to upgrade those and make sure that we're removing whether they're nitrates or not. I'm really concerned that there's such a concern about the backlash that people are saying we don't want you to even test our wells. That's not the right solution. We should make sure that we know what's in the water and then craft a solution that reduces the pollutants.
Your final custom question. You recently raised taxes in St. Paul. Can Minnesotans in greater Minnesota expect a similar tax increase if you're elected?
Well, you have to understand why that happened. First of all, I had 12 years of predecessors that played games with what it costs to actually deliver services in the city of St. Paul. And they didn't want to raise taxes, so they imposed fees. And the Supreme Court came along and said, you can't do that. You have to, we're going to take that, ability away. So we shifted. It wasn't an increase. There wasn't one additional dime of revenue for the city of St. Paul.
Okay. How about the state?
We shifted it to fees.
How about the state?
Well, I'm going to be honest about the cost of government. Property taxes are high, but that's partly, I was talking with Dane Smith yesterday, partly because we don't have fees like other states. So if you compare only property taxes state to state, we look high.
Does it sound possible? Tax increases are possible then?
Well, first of all, I'm going to make sure that the richest Minnesotans are paying their fair share. They got a tax break last year. They got a tax break under the federal bill. Richest Minnesotans are going to pay their fair share because we have services to deliver and a quality of life to maintain in the state.
Very good. We're out of time. Thank you
so much.
Democrat Chris
Absolutely.
Coleman. Thank you. Appreciate it. Great. And next up, thank you, State Representative Tina Liebling, Democrat from Rochester, making our way up here.
Hello.
Welcome. Have a seat. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly to the audience?
Yes. Good morning. I'm Tina Liebling, State Representative from Rochester. I'm in my 7th term in the Minnesota House of Representatives. In this race, I'm the candidate who supported Bernie Sanders. I like to tell people it's not because I liked his hairstyle, but it's because I thought he was talking about the real issues that are confronting this country and that are confronting Minnesota. And that is what's underlying a lot of these issues is that over a many-year period, a lot of the wealth of this nation has been concentrated more and more in very few hands, and those few hands also have a tremendous amount of political power. So I'm in this race because ordinary people need somebody to speak up for them and to stand up against all the lobbying and all the powerful interests at the Capitol, and I believe that I'm the person to do that.
Okay, you've heard the first question, workforce availability. What can you as governor do?
So this is a problem, let's be clear, this is a nationwide problem. It's a problem that's generated by the demographics that are changing. More of us are older, and so this is not going to be easily solved. I believe what we need to do is invest in our people. So for example, high school alone is not enough for anybody anymore, and yet the cost of higher education is so high that people can't get the education they need. So I believe that our state should be providing 2 years tuition free at our colleges and universities, our public colleges, or technical school.
That sounds expensive.
Well,
how do you pay for it?
It's actually not that expensive, and obviously the cost of not having workers is also very expensive. So we need to invest in our people, because we've got very good, hardworking Minnesotans, and a lot of them cannot get the training they need. Employers are saying they can't find skilled people, so there's a mismatch going on. I mean, in our public colleges, we are doing a better job of trying to match training with open positions, but people still have to pay for that, and oftentimes they want that education and they just can't afford to get it.
You talked about the aging demographics. One of the younger demographics coming to your community and population centers around the state are immigrants. What have you learned about what immigrants can bring to the workforce in rural Minnesota?
Our younger population is much more people of color. And one of the earlier candidates talked about disparities in the state. We absolutely have to address that. Rochester, where I'm from, has greater and greater immigrant community. We should welcome these folks. We should do whatever we can to help them get started, help them integrate into our communities. Explain to Minnesotans that we are all in this together. If we don't welcome our immigrants, our workforce shortages are just going to get worse and worse. And if you want somebody to take care of you when you're in the nursing home, you better be open to having different people who look different and come from different places. And this has always been the strength of our country.
And how about the housing shortage?
So again, this is related, what housing is affordable is related to what people are earning. The wages are so low, they have not gone up along with the cost of living. And in many places in the state, $15 an hour is already not even a living wage. And in greater Minnesota, in a lot of places, it's at least $13 an hour to actually be able to afford the basics of life.
So what's the state role? Higher
minimum wage?
So the
state role is raising the minimum wage and helping small employers pay that wage if necessary. If we don't do that, we're subsidizing on the back end for allowing employers to pay less than what it actually costs a worker to live.
Healthcare. You're from Rochester.
Indeed, I support getting the insurance companies out of healthcare. People want care, they don't want insurance. It's interesting to hear the Republicans always going after MNsure. MNsure is just an exchange. It's there to make an irrational health insurance system a little bit more consumer friendly. That's all it does, is it helps people buy this crazy thing called insurance.
So what do you want? You want the insurance?
I think we wouldn't even need MNsure, because people shouldn't have to buy insurance. You should, like so many other countries, we should be paying for our premium as part of our taxes. I would do it as a sliding scale. And when you need health care, you go and get the health care, because these narrowing of networks that are so hurting rural Minnesota, that's a result of our insurance system. Insurance companies narrow the network so that they can save money and improve their bottom line. It's not about care. So we need to make sure that people can actually go to the places that are near them. Everyone should be in one pool, because it's these segmenting of the insurance pool that causes a lot of the problems that we have in healthcare.
How about water? You have time to get to this question too, and balancing the chemicals and pesticides that producers need, but then also the concern about clean water.
So one of the issues when we talk about how to revitalize rural Minnesota, greater Minnesota, no one wants to move to a community where the water isn't safe. For goodness sakes, the need for clean water should come before anything. And the idea that some county commissioners don't want to test the wells because they want to protect the farmer, that's ridiculous. I mean, we should help if the farmers need help to figure out how to do it, great. But we've got to hold their feet to the fire. I mean, you cannot say, go ahead, we're not going to really make you clean up the water. people need to drink the water. We all need it. And so we've just got to make sure that that happens.
Okay, how about our president, Trump, and his stance on international trade?
So the problem with the trade agreements is that they favor huge corporations and not individual workers. I mean, the American worker has really been hit by allowing people to export jobs where the labor is really, really cheap. And so, I think that the secret on trade agreements is that they have to be fair to the worker. It's not about the corporation. So, I mean, that is my focus. I do think that we should have, Office of Trade to help Minnesotans figure out how to operate in this world. I think that's a great thing that we should do, but we shouldn't be focusing on the large corporations and subsidizing them and helping them. We should be focusing on the small business and the individual people who live in this state. I think that's the recipe for success.
A lot of folks have talked about technology and broadband, and there have been some strides in broadband access, but if you look at a map, it's still not a very good picture for rural Minnesota.
So what I would do, I think that's incredibly important. That's been talked about. It's part of having good quality of life all over the state, which is going to help people be able to stay and move to greater Minnesota, which I think is a terrific thing. But what I would do differently is I don't think we should give subsidies to private corporations and say, here, do something for us, and then you own it. If the public is investing, the public should own that investment, just like a highway. We build the highways, and then every comer can come and drive on them, and it builds our economy. That's what we need to do with broadband. Have the municipalities help them to own the broadband network, and then we can have these companies come in and bid to use it to provide the service.
Okay, your last question, written just for you. You were a vocal supporter very early of medical marijuana. Can we expect you to push for recreational use of marijuana if elected governor?
Well, actually, I'm an early and vocal supporter of that. I have $1 billion. I think that is incredibly important to remove the prohibition. And let me just say, it's not because I love marijuana, I call it cannabis, which is its real name, but it's not because I love it or think people should use it or think it's safe. It's because the prohibition is harming Minnesota. And we've seen in a lot of states now, there's a lot of experience to look to that it can be, there's a racial justice issue there, a huge one, because people who are African American get arrested 8 times as often as white people for marijuana offenses. Minnesotans spend at least $700 million a year on illegal cannabis. What are we doing? We're making criminals out of our people.
Should we tax it real quick?
Well, absolutely, we should tax it.
All right, thank you, State Representative Tina Liebling. We're done.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much. Yeah. And Congressman Tim Walz making his way up. We're doing kind of a southern Minnesota theme here with you two back to back. Thank you, Congressman Walz.
Yes.
Tell us why you want to leave Washington, D.C. and come back to Minnesota and be governor.
That's pretty self-evident, probably. But first of all, thank you all for having me. Thanks to the Newspaper Association for being critical partners in defense of democracy. For those of you who don't know, I'm Tim Walz. I grew up in a small farming community. Graduated with 24 classmates, 12 of whom were cousins. My mother still lives on that piece of land that's been in our family for 100 years. At 17, my father, a Korean Warrior veteran, took me to join the National Guard. I spent the next 24 years serving in the Army National Guard in full time. I'm a teacher by training. I met a wonderful young English teacher when I was teaching out in western Nebraska from Minnesota, and we decided this is the state we wanted to live in. This is the state we wanted to raise our children in, and it was because of the investments it made in people. It was because of the respect it showed towards education and because of the opportunities it provided. And I think this idea we're seeing right now, a broken politics that is what's holding us back in so many ways, it doesn't appear like it's going to get a whole lot better. And I believe that the state of Minnesota still has a path where bipartisan solutions and real ideas to improve people's lives are what matter most. And I think as governor, I've had the privilege over the last 11 years to represent southern Minnesota in the United States Congress, the 9th largest agricultural district. Not theoretically, how do you represent rural Minnesota, but actually doing it in partnership with folks in an effective manner. And I think I can bring that to the governor's race.
Okay, great. Let's talk that first issue, workforce development. What can you do as governor?
Yeah, and this is in its multi-approach. There's wonderful things happening out there right now. For example, down in Fairmont, Superintendent Brown has partnered with local manufacturers, AGCO and McNeely Steel. We build dump trucks, we build garbage trucks, and we build tractors in southern Minnesota. We are manufacturing high-tech technology, and we need those workforce. So what they're doing is this same question that we had. I am the father of an 11-year-old. If that young man comes home and finds his passion and he tells me he wants to be a plumber, that'll be the happiest day of my life. I know he'll have a noble trade, and I know he'll have workforce. We need to make sure they're getting the training. So what they're doing in southern Minnesota to get that workforce is they're partnering right there. They have the welding academy in the Fairmont high schools, and when those kids graduate, they are hired by places like McNeely's, making in excess of $56,000 a year doing plasma welding. That's the smart way.
Is there some cultural change too? We had an earlier candidate say we need to change the dialogue and use the bully pulpit to celebrate two-year degrees and skilled trades.
Oh, absolutely, and it starts with parents, absolutely. What we need to understand is what is the passion for each individual? Where is that workforce needed? As a teacher, I always knew I wanted to get the best out of each student so they could achieve what they wanted. I knew Thomas Jefferson was right, you need an educated population to do democracy, but I also recognize we need to provide a well-qualified workforce to them. We should celebrate who we are. This idea of Minnesota, we need and we are competing globally, but celebrate our strengths. Our strengths are collaboration. Our strengths are an incredibly well-qualified workforce. Our strengths are a work ethic that permeates, and people know this, and that's how you get that workforce there. I've heard someone say, people don't necessarily move to Minnesota for our values, they stay here for them. We need to start talking about what our values are, embrace it, and bring them, and it is working. We are creating high-paying manufacturing jobs right alongside agricultural production, right alongside the world's premier medical institution. That's what Minnesota's strengths are. It's this lack of collaboration that's holding us back, and as governor, I want to foster what's right.
If folks start moving to greater Minnesota in droves for all these open jobs, they need somewhere to live. What about the housing
That's correct.
shortage?
In 2008, I hosted the first housing summit in southern Minnesota. This is not a new issue. Anybody who's been listening, this has been growing, and it is not the same issue in each community. For example, in Worthington, one of the issues is the rent is too low. You don't often hear that, but the problem is it doesn't facilitate or incentivize building that workforce. One of the things is you see it, that this partnership with the federal level, and I think I bring the experience to this, is fighting hard. The tax bill that left the House got rid of the low-income housing tax credit that builds 30% of all affordable housing. That was reinstated in the Senate version, but we need to understand there's partnerships that go there, and this idea of working with the builders.
And how about the state and the governor?
Yes,
What
the
can
same
they
thing,
do? Yes.
incentivizing that type of care, and certainly looking at this. I want to be clear when people talk about regulations. I personally morally believe that someone shouldn't be dependent on their income to live in a safe home that is fireproof and has escapes and things like that. I'm certainly willing to look at regulations that add excessive burden, but not to weaken that. That is not the issue that's there. It's the commitment to understand the markets, and you can say whatever about they're broken. There are times when we need to build these partnerships to make sure that these things are able to get done, and the governor can do that.
Okay, how about healthcare, especially in your district? You know, that's kind of a feast or famine.
That's right.
Down in southern Minnesota,
Absolutely.
and then the rest of the state really having trouble with access, having to drive great distances,
That's
having
right.
an aging healthcare workforce. How do you incent and bring and retain healthcare providers?
Yeah, first of all, when I ran for Congress the first time, the number one issue in 2006 at the Farm Fest debate was affordable health care. Don't pretend there was a stabilization of where it was. We had tens of millions of off. So with the ACA, we added folks in, but one of the issues was with these rural areas, with the individual market, how do we make sure we get folks in? I think one of the things the governor can do is figure out if we can bring those folks into the Minnesota care system and make it work. But we're talking about this all wrong. We've spent the last 10 years discussing insurance reform. We are the leaders in preventative care. If we have a 30% childhood obesity rates, we are never going to figure out how to pay for that. So we need to leverage this and getting people there. We have resources like the Hormel Institute partnering private sector that if the cure to cancer is going to come through there. When it comes to getting the providers, we're going to have to recognize there is no market in healthcare per se. I can't go price an appendectomy and see who's better, who's got better outcomes. I don't even know what the price is when it gets there. The providers are going to go, first of all, where the jobs are at and where we're going to get them. Some of that is going to mean added incentives. In the VA system, one of the things we did was we made sure that we would help you with your medical education if you would give us a promise of serving in a rural area where our veterans are at. The state of Minnesota can incentivize those types of things to make sure it's there, to make sure that delivery of care. Once we agree upon, there isn't a lot of difference on this. Healthcare is a basic human right. We should keep people healthier so they don't have to use it, and when they use it, it shouldn't break us. Don't kid yourself if people don't have insurance. We're all paying for it anyway. We knew that ahead of time, so it makes sense for the state of Minnesota to leverage that research base, that private and public infrastructure to make us the Silicon Valley of medical research. Don't keep trying to chase our tail of treating diabetes. Let's cure it here, and the state of Minnesota has a role in that.
quick federal issue, our president and international trade and how it affects our rural and farm economies.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm the only person running for governor of Minnesota who has voted for trade deals and has voted against them, based on the merits of what gets there. We are 4% of the world's population, and yet we have to export to those markets. We can structure trade deals that are fair both to our producers, to the consumers on the other end, and meet environmental and meet worker safety on this. The president cracking back open NAFTA and some of those things, those are very nerve-wracking to farmers, especially with commodity prices low. But we need to also think about there are home markets that we need the president to continue to support. Things like the renewable fuel standards that moves us off of foreign oil and creates jobs here. So we need trade. It can be done fairly. I've supported it, and if it's wrong, I won't support it.
Okay, your last question. You've spent most of your career as a teacher, yet Minnesota has one of the worst achievement gaps. What could you do as governor to get after this disparity?
First of all, understand that getting and retaining the best teachers is a priority. Making sure the teachers are culturally competent for where those folks are at. Using the research to show dual credits is reducing some of that achievement gap, and then making it clear on this. This achievement gap of children of color should not be referred to that way. It's an achievement gap of Minnesota because this is our workforce and leaders of the future. We should make sure that we're doing everything possible to close that and get them into the workforce.
Very good. We're out of time. Thank you, Congressman Tim Walz, Democrat. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. You bet. All right. And the finale, State Auditor Rebecca Otto, Democrat. I hear you've had the honor of being the finale more than once, right?
Well, yes.
Yes.
We save the best for last.
Absolutely. And the names really were drawn randomly out of the hat.
It's great, thank you.
First of all, tell us why you want to be governor.
After serving the state as the state auditor for almost 12 years and working with local governments around the state, understanding their financial condition, their strengths, their challenges, all the infrastructure we have laying out there, having been a small businesswoman, having been a public teacher, on a school board, in the legislature, I feel like I've got the goods and plans to deliver to make sure that we actually renew Minnesota. And some people say to me, renew Minnesota? Minnesota's doing great. I'm like, you don't understand, because not all of our communities are, and depopulation is one of our bigger issues in our rural communities. And so it's figuring out how to address that so we continue to have a strong economy and equality of opportunity.
Let's start addressing those issues. You know, the first one, workforce availability. Yeah.
Yes, so I've got plans on my website, RebeccaOtto.com. As media, I know you love the meaty stuff, so it's all there. So I have a plan to provide 2 years tuition free in our Minnesota state system for all children in Minnesota up to 4 years after graduation or getting their GED. These schools are all over the state. I have a one-time appropriation that they've asked for to make sure they have the faculty, they can update their IT in their buildings. And then in exchange for that 2 years tuition free for either 2 years in a VOTEC program, community college program, or traditional 2-year university, we're going to ask them to maintain a GPA of 2.5 or better, to get a mentor in their chosen field, to provide 25 hours of community service during that program, and finally to stay in the state for 4 years after they're done. North Dakota is doing something similar, and the thing is I've been told by the greater Minnesota mayors that their kids are leaving their communities and they're staying over there. So we need to do something. We need to reinvest in our people and say to the world, we have the workforce of the 21st century and we are open for business.
And don't we have to show these young people that there's a place for them to live? So what do you do about the housing shortage?
I've been serving on the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency Board. I can't wait to go because I've been listening to the answers. I'm like, I know the answer. So we get federal resources, we get state resources, and most housing bubbles up from the local government. Okay? So it's the local government, it's private developers, it's nonprofits. When we build affordable housing in the state of Minnesota, it's this huge collaborative effort. And Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, we issue tax-exempt bonds, we get straight appropriations from the legislature, and we have workforce housing programs. We have, there's a lot of public housing that was put in the 70s that needs updating, so we want to make sure we save affordable housing that's already there. And it is divided between Metro and Greater Minnesota. So when people said we're not doing enough, we're doing what we can, but we're resource constrained. And what I can tell you today is this. There's a need statewide. We just got new data yesterday, Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, on kind of the state of housing. I think it's up over 60% now of our renters are cost burden across the state, meaning they're spending more than a third of their income on their rent. That's a serious problem for us as a state. Home ownership is a little bit less expensive because interest rates went down. But again, we need to keep our eye on the fundamental. As the rental market's tightened, as the housing market is tightened, it means costs are going to go up. So that's a really serious policy issue, and we must continue to invest. Governor Dayton has $100 million plus $15 million around affordable housing in the bonding bill. That must happen.
Healthcare, what about the lack of providers and insurers in Greater Minnesota?
I have a plan for that. Okay, so it's called the Healthy Minnesota Plan. And the Healthy Minnesota Plan, you can find all the details on my website. It's evidence-based, based on research, looking at all the plans around the world that have actually gotten to a universal healthcare system where everybody's covered. So I have a plan that will, okay, so first we have a bunch of systems in place. Parts of Greater Minnesota don't have a lot of access to healthcare, and we will address that. We have some county options right now. We've got the Mayo, we've got Sanford, we've got a bunch of different systems. And we still have some independent providers. But it's getting to a place where all Minnesotans are covered, regardless of employment status, age, or pre-existing conditions. It's creating a single payer at the state level, a protected fund. We will have a health board, and we're going to reduce costs by at least 15%. This is all evidence-based. So that, you know, when I'm in the rural areas, and especially our small businesses, I'm going to create an environment that is perfect to grow the homegrown innovators. And so I'm going to focus on local economies. By getting this done, it will be good for our farmers, our Main Street businesses, for everybody, so that we get rid of the inequities. And you know how we repopulate Greater Minnesota communities? We get this thing done. People will flock here to start businesses, and we have so many great communities for them to live in. So,
Healthcare had a federal layer. Let's talk trade and federal layer, because our president is talking about changing trade deals. This can affect small businesses you were talking about, our farmers. What's your stance on his international trade?
So I serve on the Rural Finance Authority Board, and I have for almost 12 years, where we finance farm operations. So, and every February we have a sit down with someone from the, you know, usually Federal Reserve or somebody that works in ag finance. And I think they're scaring farmers to death, frankly. And that fear is making people sick. And we've already had issues with commodity prices around corn and soybean, and we had cash flow issues the year before, and so there's a lot of stress. We don't need any more stress. Our dairy farmers, you know, they always worked so hard to produce dairy, and it's never been easy for them. And my son wanted to be a dairy farmer, and I remember talking to him a little bit about it. I'm like, you don't get to go on vacations. It's a tough life. But at the end of the day, he is scaring people to death. So what he should be doing is to do no harm. He's creating chaos. But right now we live in a global economy. We all work to feed the world, and he needs to understand some basic concepts.
What about broadband?
Yes, so I have a plan coming for that.
Rebecca, I have a plan, Otto, right?
Well, you know what? I'm the only one that's put out really detailed evidence-based plans where we had researchers and policy experts and economists work on developing them. I'm really serious about running for governor, and I'm being totally transparent, so you can dig in and you can look at it. I've watched you, Mary, for years grilling and drilling governor candidates to say, well, how would you pay for that? How would you do that? I'm putting it all out there for you to see. So I have a piece. My Renew Minnesota statewide vision has 5 pieces, and this piece coming is going to be all about local economies, Main Street businesses. When you have depopulation, it's really hard to support your Main Street businesses, keep your schools open, hard to have daycare, hard to attract young families. Because to me, broadband is like the electrification of America. It's just a basic essential to operating in today's economy and society. And we've had federal resources to fund it, we've had some state resources to fund it. And now with net neutrality, we may run into a whole bunch of issues. We do already have public-private partnerships in some communities. We had a county in Greater Minnesota that worked to put everything in, and they don't have the population base to keep the services going. So we must continue to dig in on this issue.
Last question, written just for you. You've been a vocal opponent of chemical and pesticide use for agriculture production. How will you reassure farmers across the state that you won't ban chemicals they use every day?
Well, so I live on a small farm, and I work on the Rural Finance Authority Board, and at the end of the day, it's really about making sure they're at the table when we're considering policies. And that's really it. It's making sure that we have clean water, that our farmers are successful, that they have viable crops, that we develop a viable 3rd and 4th crop for them when commodity prices are down on the traditional corn and soybean. And also continuing to support the University of Minnesota and all the important research they do around agriculture, perennial crops, cover crops, so that when they can reduce their input costs, and I already know this from Rural Finance Authority, they will do better. And so it's helping them reduce the input costs, including chemicals.
Okay, very good. We're out of time, and we are done. We got through all 9. We want to thank all the candidates for participating, all of you for helping write the questions, Newspaper Association, Center for Rural Policy Development, and our sponsor, Compeer Financial. Thanks, everybody.